behalf of the American Sephardi Federation Institute of Jewish Experience, we are so happy to welcome Joyce Zonana here with us today and to have her speaking about the various authors. I'm sure she will address some of the issues that have already come up, which I love this, and we will definitely be talking about it. We have Jason Guberman, who's the executive director of the American Sephardi Federation, here today, and he will introduce Joyce as well as give a little welcome. So,
thank you.
Yes. Well, I just wanted to give a brief welcome. We're very honored to have you with us today, and this continues a long tradition at ASF of having events that explore this subject. I mean, we've honored Albert Memmi with our Pomegranate Award for Lifetime Achievement. We've co-hosted Yitzhak Gormezano Goren. Of course, we've had Lucette Lagnado, blessed memory, and André Aciman many times at the ASF. It seems that there's a trend with what the names I was mentioning, which is that how many Egyptian Jews, especially from Alexandria, but also from Cairo, have written wonderful memoirs. People like Jean Nagar and others who also deserve mention. André Aciman is traveling right now from the Maldives, but wanted me to convey please wish Joyce my all-time best from one Egyptian Jew to another. And so I wanted to share that with you, and thank you so much again for joining us.
Okay, thank you. So I guess I should jump right in and say thank you for inviting me and for hosting this, and for bearing with the technical difficulties that I've been experiencing since I agreed to do this presentation, which I was very excited about. I've had some physical challenges, and they got in the way of my doing a presentation as fancy as I would like, but I'll do the best I can.
Yes, but Joyce at 50% is most of us at 120%. So I'm excited for this anyway. I do want to remind everybody that your microphones and cameras are off until the end of the presentation. Please do continue to write in the chat, even provocative things. We're good with that. Yeah. We will talk about them. Please continue to put them in the chat and Q&A, and we will get to them. I do want to make a note that Joyce is a writer and literary translator and a professor emerita at the City University of New York. And her memoir, Dream Homes from Cairo to Katrina, An Exile's Journey, was published in 2008 by the Feminist Press. She has translated numerous books. One of them she came to speak to us about, A Land Like You. And we are very honored to have her here today. So now please begin.
So let me say how this presentation came about. And I know it is a little controversial, just even the title, Arab Jewish, and we can talk about that as we go on. But I did, in the fall, I presented a 4-week course at the 92nd Street Y called Introduction to Arab Jewish Literature. And so what I'm doing today is kind of a quick overview of what I did in that course. And in preparing that course, so before doing that course, I knew Egyptian Jewish literature very, very well. I'd read André Aciman, I'd read Lucette Lagnado, of course. I'd looked up as much as I could look up in order to write my own memoir, but I really wasn't familiar with the literature from other Jews of the Middle East and North Africa. And so to prepare for that course, I gave myself a crash course, which I did at the New York Public Library in Manhattan. And they have an extraordinary collection, and they made their collection available to me. And I read very widely in Moroccan, Algerian, Tunisian, Iraqi Jewish literature, mostly of the 20th century, and learned a great deal. And I guess my starting point, my real starting point in this whole area of study is a book called After Jews and Arabs, Remaking Levantine Culture, written by Amiel Alkalai. I think it was published sometime in the 1980s. And it's a book that tries to argue for a different way of thinking about the opposition Jew-Arab, which we have seemed to have taken for granted as an eternal opposition. there's like not a coexistence or, living together of Jews and Arabs. And we know that the establishment of the State of Israel and the rise of Arab nationalism certainly helped to make that division seem as if it was a permanent division. But one of the things that Amiel argues for in his book is that it was not always the case, and that it is possible actually to reimagine a new time when that doesn't have to be the case anymore. So part of what I'm doing here today is exploring how that division came to be the case, and how we might reimagine things in the future. So there are so many ways of thinking about this.
Before we get into thinking about it, sorry,
Yeah.
Can you just tilt the camera down a little bit?
Sure.
You have a lot of shout outs, how amazing it is to see you and hear you. So I just have to also add that. And not that far, now we get just a little bit more up. There we go, beautiful, perfect.
Okay, so I had wanted to have lots of audio visuals, not audio visuals, but visuals, slides to show you, and I was unable to put those slides together. But I will send them all to Drora when we're done, and Drora, maybe you will make them available to people so that if they
definitely will, excellent.
Write to you, you can send things to them, and they can get a little more information about what I'm going to do very briefly here today. So the main thrust of my argument is going to be that Jews lived in Arab lands for a very long time. We know that. Did they always get along with the Muslims and Christians around them? Did they not? Were there issues? Were there not? I'm not going to go deeply into that. I'm not going to say, oh, it was perfect. I'm not going to say, oh, it was terrible. But what I am going to say is that something really changed with the incursion of the French into North Africa. The invasion of Algiers by the French in 1830 changed things very significantly for everybody living in North Africa, obviously in Algeria. And even before 1830, there was something that happened. I think it was like in the later 18th century, there was established in France, in Paris, something called the Alliance Israélite Universelle. Some of you may have heard about this, which established schools throughout the Middle East to somehow elevate the condition of the Jews living in Arab lands. There was this assumption that the Jews living in Arab lands were backward, were ignorant, we're not European, and we're not French. And these schools were set up to raise their standard of living, to educate them in French, and to inculcate in them, the French ideals of égalité, fraternité, etc. And to create almost an aspiration towards Frenchness and a rejection of their surrounding culture. So in 1830, the French invaded Algiers, and it was a particularly brutal colonization that they enacted. And early on in that process, and I don't have the exact date, I'm sorry, I think it was 1870, there was a decree that was issued in France. It was called the Crémieux Decree, which declared that the Jews of northern Algeria were henceforth to be considered French citizens, while the Muslims were not. The Muslims were considered indigènes, native people. And the Jews became French citizens, and they had all the rights of French citizens. You can imagine what that would do to the relations between the Jews and the Muslims, who were being treated horribly. There were very early after the Crimea Decree, there were numerous, what are now called pogroms, attacks on Jews in cities in Algeria, which may have occurred before, but seemed to occur with particular virulence in response to this particular decree. A really good book, if you're interested in this moment, and it's a wonderful book, is called The Rabbi's Cat by Joanne Svar. It's a graphic novel, and it focuses on a rabbi in Algeria in this late part of the 19th century, and he's dealing with these changes, and he's having to study French. And he's being judged by a rabbinical board in Paris, which has nothing to do with his life in Algiers. Anyway, so that's a useful thing to look at. And so the animosity that was engendered between the Muslims and the Jews, the resentment of Muslims against Jews who were being considered French citizens. Why did the French decide that the Jews should be citizens and the Muslims not? Who knows? How did the Jews feel about having been named citizens? Some of them perhaps enjoyed it. Some of them felt ambivalent about it. One writer that gives us some really interesting information about this is Jacques Derrida, who some of you may know. What are you wanting to do? Some of you may know is one of the major philosophers of the 20th century. He wrote in French. He wrote, towards the end of his life, he wrote a book called The Monolingualism of the Other. And it's a book about growing up in Algeria, being Jewish, and somehow not having a mother tongue. Arabic was the language he heard around him, but French was the language he was supposed to use in school. There was no Yiddish, there was no they didn't use Ladino apparently in Algeria. So there was no language that was his language. And he writes very heartbreakingly about this not having a home in language, because French was the one he was supposed to speak. Arabic was the one his grandparents spoke, for example, and he was not supposed to speak it. Another writer of around the same period, also a philosopher, is Helene Cixous, who is one of the first, not the first, so she was a feminist writer, and she founded the first women's studies program in Paris. Very outspoken, very extraordinary writer. I read her early on in my academic life. I had no idea that she was Jewish. I had no idea. And I never knew that Derrida was Jewish. It's not usually foregrounded when people talk about him. It's not usually foregrounded that he's Jewish from North Africa. But Cixous was also Jewish from North Africa. And she writes about what happened during World War II. So the Jews had been made citizens in the previous century. But then during World War II, during the Vichy regime, how were they going to be treated in these French territories, right? Algeria was a department of France. And it became, they lost their privileges, let's put it that way. They lost their privileges. And she writes about not even using, her mother not using the word juif, not saying it. She would just use the letter J, je. And I found that very interesting because Cixous is a writer who is very much about asserting herself and asserting the power of women's writing. And je, she claims that at the same time that she's hiding her Jewishness. So that's an interesting consequence of French colonialism, and then going back on their promise right? Going back on their promise of treating the Jews special. There's a whole long analysis that we would have to do here of what went on with, French anti-Semitism and anti-Islam, which we still see today. Okay, so the colonization of Algeria, the Alliance Israélite Universelle.
Can I interrupt
Yes.
you again? Sorry.
Yeah.
First, if you could, again, the camera keeps sneaking up. Sorry about that.
Okay.
And somebody asked what was the nature of the French relationship with Algeria before 1830 that allowed or encouraged the creation of French schools?
So the French schools were created all throughout the Middle East. It wasn't just Algeria. They were created in Egypt. They were created in Iraq. They were created in Morocco. They were created everywhere. Why was that done? I don't know. There were a group of Jewish educators in France who somehow took it upon themselves to want to spread this enlightened Judaism somehow, this modern Judaism to the people they considered to be backward, living in the Middle Eastern countries.
And French was considered more the language of the upper class or the educated, sorry.
Educated, the modern world, right? It's the modern world, not the old world, right?
And I think that leads into Vivian's question. That she resents the fact that these authors are called Arab Jews, which you alluded to at the beginning. They all wrote in French, as you're commenting on, and they discussed in French. They're discussed in French anthologies. So why did you decide to call them Arab Jews?
Well, that's exactly the question. Why do you resent the fact that they're called Arab? Why would you resent the fact that?
Well, she's saying they probably did not even know how to write in Arabic.
Actually, some of them did. And what's at stake here is that there is this rejection within ourselves, and I'm including myself here, within ourselves of this Arab connection. And that rejection of that Arab connection was probably fostered precisely by this intoxication with or excitement about identifying with Europe, identifying with France. And that brings me to the book I want to start with, which is a novel published in 1951 by Jacqueline Kahanoff. And the novel is called Jacob's Ladder. There was recently, like 2 weeks ago, the New York Times ran a beautiful story about Jacqueline Kahanoff. You can look it up. It was called, what was the story called? Unforgotten No More, or something like that. Basically, it was a story about people, important people to whom the New York Times had failed to give obituaries. And they were now honoring these people. And Jacqueline Kahanoff was one of the people they were honoring. Why were they honoring her? She was a very prolific writer. She moved from Egypt. She was born in like 1917, I think. And in the 1940s, she moved from Egypt to the United States. And then she moved to France. And then she eventually settled in Israel. And in Israel, she was well known as a cultural critic. She wrote her essays in English, but they were translated into Hebrew. They were all published in Hebrew. And she wrote about her generation of Jews who had grown up in Egypt. And she wrote some fiction. And she also wrote about the treatment of Mizrahi Jews in Israel in the 1950s, right? Which was, as we know, was not always very good, right? It was not a very welcoming embrace. Again, in part because of this sort of European disdain for all things African and North African, including, what we classify Arab. So she wrote quite a lot about that. And this novel, which I find so interesting, which she published in 1951 in English, is called Jacob's Ladder. And it's out of print. I'm hoping to bring it into print, and we'll see. But I can send you some examples from it. In this novel, it's a sort of semi-autobiographical growing up story of a young girl growing up in Cairo in the 1920s and 30s. She's Jewish. She's from a Jewish family that has two sides to it. One side is Tunisian and one side is Iraqi. The Tunisian family are fair-skinned, French-speaking, very much wanting to embrace European culture and live like by European standards. The Iraqi side of her family is from Baghdad. They speak Arabic. They dress in traditional clothes. They live in a quieter neighborhood. Traditional clothes, I mean the women wear head coverings, they wear robes. Their manners are very different. They eat with their hands, they put food in the middle of the table and they eat with their hands. They don't eat with a knife and fork. And they speak Arabic. And the young child observes this difference in these two sides of her family. And the novel explores how this difference came to be and what it means in her psyche. So her father, who is from Baghdad, does not speak French and is so uncomfortable around the woman he married, her mother, because he can't go to where she goes and the child is raised speaking French. And he's so upset about not being able to speak Arabic, about his French not being good enough. His last name is Gaon, Gaon, which I've come to understand means sort of learned person, right? I wrote an article about this book. It's called "She Would Rather Be a Gaon Than a Gaul." So if you went to a French school, a French-speaking school in North Africa or anywhere in the French colonies, there's this famous line that most post-colonial writers talk about, where they would talk about nos ancêtres les Gaulois, our ancestors, the Gauls, right? That was a way, somehow the French wanted their students to think of themselves as being descended from the original Gauls. And the protagonist in the novel, Rachel, goes to a French school and she wants to be a French person. And then by the end of the novel, she comes to learn more about her father and more about his life. And she ends up thinking to herself, she would rather be a Gaon than a Gaul. It's a beautiful moment, right? Where she is embracing that Arab self that her French education had taught her to deny, had taught her to reject, had taught her was barbaric, had taught her was, primitive, all of those things. And this is a Jewish Arab self, right? It's not a Muslim Arab self or a Christian Arab self. It's a Jewish Arab self because her grandparents are from Baghdad. One interesting thing about Baghdad, there were Alliance Israélite Universelle schools in Baghdad. They were established in the 19th century, but in Baghdad, they refused, somehow the leaders of the Jewish community refused to let the education be exclusively in French. So they had the schools run by the French, but they had their education in Arabic. So in Baghdad, the Jews there held on to their Arabic heritage much, much more than the Jews in other parts of North Africa. And we see that difference coming out in who today is willing and comfortable claiming Arab Jewishness. It's tending to be writers and scholars who are from Iraq rather than writers and scholars who are from Egypt. There are some from Morocco who are more willing to claim it. There's one in particular from Morocco who's very willing to claim it, a guy named Edmond Amran El Maleh, again, very obscure writer, but he was very important in Morocco. So what do you do with this? Or what happens when you're being educated to think of France as the guiding light of life, and to think of where you are as somehow backward and not worthwhile. And so, Viviane, forgive me, but I think that there's that your resentment of being called Arab kind of is a reflection of that. I mean, I don't know. We could talk about it a lot. But why would we resent being called Arab if there wasn't some negative association with Arab? And I would maintain that that negative association was inculcated by the French colonialism and sort of the whole French way of being. And in the novel Jacob's Ladder, we see the difference between the two sides of the family, the Tunisian side of the family and the Iraqi side of the family. And in Tunis, Tunis was much earlier made into a French colony, and there was something to be gained by being French, by speaking French. It was like the cultural capital, is the way people talk about it. And if you read Albert Memmi, Pillar of Salt, he also talks about that rift in his own being, and that rejection that of his Arab Jewish self, because he wants to pass, right? Because he wants to get by in the world where you get by as a bourgeois, French speaker. So that's kind of what Kahanoff, I think, explores in the novel Jacob's Ladder. And the child, Rachel, comes to a kind of resolution of it when finally, towards the end, she understands the heritage that she's gotten from her father, and she's more than willing to let go of the French European heritage that she's gotten from her mother. Another way she puts it in the book, she makes it, so in Egypt, of course, the French were not officially colonizers, but there were so many schools that were in French. My parents went to French schools. I was raised speaking French. One of the things people always say when I say to people I'm Jewish Egyptian, and they say, "Oh, do you speak Egyptian?" And I say, "Well, no, there's no such thing as Egyptian. But no, I don't speak Arabic, as a matter of fact. I speak French." Why do you speak French? Why do I speak French? It's a long explanation. It's a long explanation that has to do with this sort of cherishing of this French ideal, which both was imposed in some places and chosen by some people. So Rachel, the character in Jacob's Ladder, she has a British nanny, and the British nanny is hired by the mother because the mother wants to raise a child that will never have to be ashamed of not having European manners, right? And this British nanny is brutal to the child, and she separates her from her connection with Egyptian street life, as it were. And at one point, Rachel thinks that she doesn't like the pink people meaning the British people, and she would rather be with the brown people, that she feels closer to the brown people than to the pink people. So that's a separation that's made. It's an interesting separation. She loves being out on the street in Egypt. And this is like the 1920s and 1930s. And I find this book really fascinating because it gives us the background of the other Egyptian Jewish memoirs and novels that we have, André Aciman, Lucette Lagnado, my own work, Jean Nagar's work. This gives us what happened the generation before, the generation that lived through the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s in Egypt. And part of what they were living through was the Egyptian nationalist movement, which was against the British, which sort of started in 1926. And one of the mottos of that movement, let's see if I can get it right, but has something to do with not caring about religion and, wanting to have a nation that was just a nation that embraced all the different members of it. And Kahanoff and a group of her fellow students, herself and her character in the book, was identified with the Egyptian nationalist movement against the British. She wanted to see the British leaving Egypt because the British were also dominating Egyptian life, taking money away from people and so on. And she identified as a communist or leftist, very much so. And she knew that her father actually had said to her something like, if we get rid of the British, we will lose our safety as Jews. But she nevertheless felt that was important to do that. One point in the novel, I find this an especially moving section of the novel, and it's especially moving to me right now because we just lived through a period like this. There's a year when Ramadan, Passover, and Coptic Easter are all at the same time. And we just went through that actually just last month. It was Ramadan, it was Passover, and it was Easter. So everybody was celebrating their very special holiday. And Kahanoff in Jacob's letter writes about the child experiencing this moment in Cairo when everybody was united by this common, that they went to their different places of worship, but out on the street, they were united by this common connection with this holy moment. And it's also the year that Rachel somehow experiences her first Passover Seder. The Passover Seder is something that features in so many Egyptian Jewish memoirs and novels, because obviously in the Passover Seder, we say we're happy to be out of Egypt, right? We're happy to be freed from this place of oppression. And that always confused me when I was a child growing up, because my parents' memories of Egypt were not negative memories. They were very positive memories. Why would we be happy leaving? André Aciman writes about that in Out of Egypt, his last Seder in Alexandria. We're not happy to be going, this was a good place. We lived here very well until things changed. But in the 30s and 40s, 20s, 30s and 40s, and even before that, Jews in Egypt had a very good life. They did very well financially, and there may have been some discrimination, but there was not that much. So it was always a puzzle. Why would we want to be happy at Passover? Kahanoff has a whole different take on this, and she writes in her novel about Rachel first learning about Passover, and what she's horrified by when she learns about Passover is the plagues and the brutality of the punishment that is inflicted on the Egyptians before the Jews are permitted to leave. And she's overwhelmed by that. She's a child and she can't understand it. She has Egyptian friends. She feels identified with the brown people. And she asks her father, is it wrong for me to care about the Egyptians? Why is this happening? So she's just very, very traumatized actually by hearing the Passover story for the first time. Why didn't she hear it until she was 7 or 8 years old? I don't know, but apparently the French side of her family was not that into Jewish ritual, whereas the Iraqi side of the family was, but the Iraqi side of the family was kind of dominated by the French side. So at any rate, her take on Passover is particularly interesting. Yeah. So shall I go on from there or whatever?
I'm going to insert a little bit here because there are a few different things. You were talking about different Arab types of culture that did come into the community. And so I'm just going to, so somebody did ask, do you think that the Jews in these lands were culturally Arab, whatever that means? And I think that you answered that there definitely were some cultural elements.
There were, absolutely.
I do want to add that Marion Sofer wrote into the group, first of all, that the Iraqi Jews were more open to being called Arab Jews.
Absolutely.
She's saying that even her husband says that as well,
Mm-hmm.
is that he's open to becoming an Arab Jew and others not necessarily. But she also talks about the Iraqi food and the Middle Eastern music and even belly dancing. And yes, there were definitely cultural overlaps.
Yeah, I mean, and I think if you look at, just the geography, right? So Iraq is further away from Europe than these other, than the North African.
Exactly.
And the French never got to Iraq somehow. The British were there. But somehow this aspiration to French culture was something that possessed the Jews of North Africa, and it never possessed the Iraqis in the same way. And the Iraqis were more proud, and the Iraqi Jews, in some ways, were probably even more integrated and a part of the surrounding culture than in other North African places.
Even than Egypt, you think?
I think so, yes. I think that there was an intellectual life in Iraq for Jews. They were writers, journalists. They participated very strongly in the culture, like the culture, part of the culture. In Egypt, yes, there were Egyptian Jews who were writers, and we know that there were Jews who were, actresses and, singers and so on, and in Morocco as well. But I think in Iraq, there were more Jews who were involved in literary culture somehow. That's from reading Nassim Rejwan's book. I don't remember the title of it. I think it's called I don't remember, Nassim Rejwan. I'd have to find it. But it's a memoir of being in Baghdad and in the 20th century. And he calls Baghdad a Jewish city. Like New York, he says Baghdad, Jewish city. And I don't think you could say that of other cities in other cities in North Africa. There's a way in which there was a much more this sort of presence of the Jews and non-separation between the Jews and the Muslims, and an embrace of the language, the food, the music, it's all of it.
Okay, and then Victor mentioned that the story of the European colonists making alliance with Sephardic Jews is actually a much older story.
Mm-hmm.
Then Algeria in 1742, the Sultan's banker, David Zonana, was beheaded by a disgruntled member. You can continue if you want to continue it. That's okay.
No, I don't know. My brother knows the story. I don't know.
He was beheaded by a disgruntled member of the Janissary Corps, and the British and French promptly installed his son as Otzik Bardani, paymaster of the Janissary Corps. And he says, see Zonana Family Jewish Encyclopedia in the Jewish Encyclopedia. So just
but so there's.
I'm just gonna, while you're talking, you can continue to talk. I just want to invite people to open your cameras and microphones, not microphones, but first open your cameras, and if you want to ask a question, then you can do it live. But please continue, Joyce. Sorry.
There's this great movie that I happened to see last fall. It's called Indigènes. It's a beautiful movie. It's not so much about Jews, but it's about how the French treated the Algerians. So in World War II, they recruited soldiers from Algeria to fight for de Gaulle, to fight for free France. And they recruited these soldiers and treated them horribly, and never gave them their pensions. It's just a really good example, an illustration of the attitude of the French towards native North Africans. It's well worth seeing. And it helps to understand why non-Jews would resent the Jews for being given the privileges of the French. It doesn't fully explain why the Jews would want to aspire to be French. But if you're going to be treated like dirt, I guess you don't want to be treated like dirt. So you're going to want to be the one who does that treating. You're going to want to be the one who calls the shots. And so I think, and French culture is very appealing. I like it too. I like French literature. I like reading Proust. I like it. I don't know, admittedly, I don't know enough about Arab culture, and I'm trying to educate myself much, much more about it, because I think it's a terrible gap. My father spoke very good Arabic. He worked as a interpreter in the courts, in the mixed courts in Cairo, interpreting between French and Arabic. So his Arabic was quite good. My mother did not really have Arabic. And I used to talk to her about that, and they studied it in school. So here she is in Cairo, in a French school, and she's not learning the language of the people around her. Like, what is that all about? What would it be like to be studying a foreign language as your main language, right? So she's studying French. When she went to Paris for the first time when she was like 75 or something like that. And she said, I knew the map of Paris like the back of my hand. So Paris was not a strange place to her, because she knew more about Paris than she knew about Aswan or something, right? She knew no Egyptian history. She knew French history. And she was not unique. I think this was common for many people. André Aciman actually talks about in his own family sort of a split between the French speakers and the Arabic speakers. Lucette Lagnado talks about that too. And there are many families where, one side of the family embraced the French and the other side, just did what they did. In my family, my grandmother on my father's side was Syrian, and she spoke very little French. And there was tension between these two ways of being. Yeah.
I think we hear that with the questions today too.
Exactly. And is that a manufactured? Is it natural? Is it manufactured? Is it evil? Is it imposed? It's not just imposed. I think that there was a choice that you wanted to be sophisticated and French, and wear those fancy clothes, and know which spoon to use with your soup and all that stuff. Edward Said, in his memoir, Edward Said, a Palestinian writer, wrote a memoir called Out of Place. And he was educated in Cairo at a British school. And he was taught to not eat with his hands. He was taught to not, use too much Arabic. I was taught to not eat with my hands. I still have fights with some of my family members because I just want to like dig in, the way African people eat, right? You have the common dish at the center of the table, and that's how you eat. So table manners, politeness, sophistication. That's what people wanted. And, how was North Africa regarded by Europeans at that time? Did you want to be able to get around in North Africa, or did you want to be able to go to Paris and Rome and London? Which would you rather do?
I want to say that we have a podcast series called Reclaiming Identity, where we have different people from different places and different generations telling about their experiences. And these two sisters whose mother was from Cairo were talking about how the sophistication, it was known that in their house you ate only the fanciest foods, and it was served on the best china all the time, and you had to be dressed. Anybody who's I know from Cairo is I'm in awe of the way they dress. I'm sorry, I know that's a little superficial, but they're just so elegant. I don't know, they hold themselves so I know that's very that's a little superficial, but I'm just saying that's Marianne. I'm sorry, did you want to say something?
I would just add that, as I'm sure most of you remember, even 50 years ago, French was the international diplomatic language.
Exactly.
So it was
it opened doors.
It was a almost necessary tool for functioning if you left your own country. And the people who started the Alliance were very aware that this group of students may need to leave at some point, and they were very focused on giving them tools to prosper and have professional lives when they left, so that when they emigrated, they'd have the tools not just to survive, but to really prosper as professionals abroad. And I think they were very successful at that. Yeah. Also, I once saw on the internet a history of the struggle that the Alliance had in starting the school in Baghdad. They had to convince the rabbis to let the parents feel okay about putting their kids in the Alliance. And some of these rabbis themselves had yeshivot where they taught only religious studies.
Yes, because it was
they had to be okay with saying, yes, it's okay.
That's right.
It's okay to get a secular education.
That's
it's
right.
a good
That's
thing.
Right. That's right.
And it's a very moving story, I think.
Yeah.
Because they were doing something that was against their immediate interest in leading the community. And yet they somehow got that this is really for the benefit of those students.
And I think the Alliance was also interested in creating a sort of international community, of creating a kind of Jewish identity that transcended location, so that they were, even though it was more secular, there was also a sense of Jewish identity that crossed borders rather than, we're Baghdadi or Irene or whatever, but we're Jews. And it ultimately enters into a kind of Zionist vision of a Jewish nationhood as opposed to just Jewish religion, right? So that's part of what was going on with the Alliance. I'm not sure if it was the foregrounded thing, but I think it was part of what happened. There's books and lots of studies of the Alliance, and they had a very profound impact on those cultures. Yeah.
Vivian Beda, you wanted to say something?
Oh, yes. Hi, Vivian Beda.
Oh, did you just want to say hi? I didn't know you had your hand up before.
No, I'm happy to be here and listening to Joyce, and I hope you're feeling wonderful.
I am. Thank you. It's wonderful that you're here. That's the wonderful
What
part.
miss it for anything?
Professor
So-
von Wittelsbach also had a question or a comment.
Yes, just a brief comment. First of all, thank you to everybody for this wonderful presentation. I'm speaking to you from Ithaca, New York, where I teach at Cornell University, among other things, also Francophone and
So you
Italian.
know Deborah Starr, of course, I imagine.
He was writing about her.
She's the one who wrote one of the books.
Yeah.
And her wonderful, she has done incredible work on Kahanoff.
Yes. Yeah.
So I do my in the kind of center of my professional life are Jewish communities in the Balkans, and Italy, and Francophone ones. And I wanted to say, French, there's a time for every language, and it was the language of culture in the whole Western Hemisphere. Well, first Italian and Spanish, then it came the turn of French. And then now it's the turn of English, right? I mean, why do people everywhere around the world want their children in English-speaking schools as to signal some sort of openness? Now, and I know these schools are not often the best. American schools in this world are not often the best schools. Very often the local schools were better.
Sure.
But people have reasons why they're sending children to learn English very quick, very, very early. And so that's number one. I mean, we have to realize French was really, as I think Marianne pointed out, it was the language to aspire to. Russia spoke French.
Of course, exactly.
Germany spoke French. The whole of Scandinavia, the Balkans spoke French. Italy spoke French.
It's a beautiful language. No,
it was the cultural model of that time. Now. And we can debate whether we have evolved or devolved other cultural models. And the other thing, that was part one of my comment. And the second part was, I wish the world would know more about Miriam Bem from Algeria. I taught her work.
Oh, yes, absolutely, yes.
I've been translating her, but it seems that there is not much interest because she was on the Algerian cultural scene.
She's fascinating, yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
Algeria was perceived to be an ally of the Eastern Bloc, and she was also a communist.
Yes.
A member of the resistance, right?
Yes.
Not a very appealing figure to kind of promote. I wish she would be more present.
I wish so too. I just discovered her, in this crash course I gave myself. I discovered her, and I also discovered another Algerian Jewish writer who was very popular at the beginning of the 20th century, named Rais. She went.
Elsa Rais.
Yes, fascinating. So fascinating. So I would like to translate her, and I'd like to translate Miriam Ben. And there's another Moroccan Jewish writer who's very interesting, is El Maleh. So these are writers who maybe rejected the seduction of France.
Could you just write those names in the chat? Just the names. I know more will come later, but would be helpful.
No, we're going to have a list. So, Joyce, you'll send me your syllabus, and we'll have the list of that.
Yeah.
After. So, do you have okay with 2 more questions?
Sure.
Joyce?
Sure.
Amiel.
Hey, hi.
Hey.
I just really wanted to say hello, Joyce. It's so great to see you and hear you.
It's so great to have you here. You're the founding, you're the leader in this field. You're the one who opened up this field, really.
Well, thank you. That was, anyways, that's all. I don't really have a question or anything. I just wanted to say hi, and we're very
That's
glad.
important too. Aliyah, did you have?
Yes, hello. Also, hi, Joyce.
Hi.
My question is, if you've noticed any change over time, like through different decades, how authors have not only approached their own writing, but also like the way that they've thought about their own identities. Like this use of the word Arab Jewish literature is very recent, and I know that you and I have talked about this.
Well, so here's very interesting thing is André Aciman in his last novel called Harvard Square. I don't remember when it was published, but in that novel, I mean, Aciman, I take as an example of the Francophile, right? You know, I mean, he's absolutely identified with French and, you know, with Proust and so on and so forth. But in this novel, it's a somewhat autobiographical novel. There's a character who is a migrant from Egypt who's studying for his PhD at Harvard. And while he is studying for his PhD at Harvard, he becomes friends with a North African man, I think from Tunisia. I can't remember quite where he's from. I think he's from Tunisia. He's, you know, the narrator, who is the double in a way of Aciman, embraces this other character who is like his like other self. He's kind of unmannered. He speaks Arabic. He's not identified with France. He's Muslim. He's not Jewish. And the narrator character gets very involved with this man and very drawn to him and sees him as his repressed self, you know, like who he would be if he could really be free. And so I read that novel. I've written an article about that novel. I read that novel as Aciman saying, I'm embracing my Arab self. I've rejected that Arab self all along, but here I am, I'm embracing it. And I think he does come to a different relationship to that part of himself. I don't know for sure, but that's my interpretation of that novel. It gives us something very different than we had in Out of Egypt and all the other novels and essays that he's written that are very European, if you will. And here there's this connection with this non-European self and this love, this deep love for this non-European self and this regret. At the end of the novel, there is regret for having rejected him because he rejects him, he pushes him away. And there's regret for having done that. There's one scene in the novel where there's like it's not a contest, but where there's like a rivalry between Kulthum and Maria Callas. So there's this party and people are listening to Maria Callas sing the opera. And the North African character is talking about Kulthum, the Egyptian singer. And, who are we going to listen to? Who are we going to value? Are we going to value Italian opera? Or are we going to value Kulthum and her beautiful music, which was also nationalist and, connected with Arab identity. And it's a very moving and heartbreaking kind of moment when the Kalaj is the name of the character, when is at this party that he's organized, and everybody at the party is talking. I don't think Maria Callas has just died or something, and everybody is all, involved with that. And he's like, what about Kulthum? So there you go. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Yes, thank you. I mean, I feel like there's just so much to say when it comes to this, and I was interested to see what you could say in the limited amount of time that we had.
Yeah.
Can we let June ask, and then Jason will close it out?
Okay.
Thank you. Hi, Joyce. It's really great to see you. So my question is about, you said rejection within ourselves with this Arab connection. That was really intriguing to me. If you remember our conversation, I guess back in 2019, I think we discussed about racialization in that rejection or repressed.
Yes.
When I was talking about my research on Chinese Korean people who migrated to Japan during colonialism, they have to, reject or repress their Koreanness and that identity because there was a very government-led, ideological process of racializing colonized Korean people. So I wonder if you can, delve into a little bit more about that racialization in that rejection, like Arab Jews, like kind of, in a way, dichotomy between Arab Jew and European Jew. Is there any racialization attached to it?
Absolutely, absolutely. And Amiel, at the beginning of his book, After Jews and Arabs, he talks about the relationship of Jew and Arab, in particular, the relationship of the Jew to the Arab within him or herself, right? And that there is a racialization that some of us have chosen to accept, and some have not, right? Yeah. And then we have to look at the whole history of Orientalism in Europe and the European views of indigenous people, all indigenous people, but particularly indigenous people in the Orient. It's very complicated. And do we internalize those views, or do we challenge them?
Jason?
I know what's the cost of doing it.
Thank you, Dora, and thank you, Joyce, for this wonderful, wonderful talk. I've really enjoyed it. I think everyone, the fact that we've gone so far over and have so many questions is a testament to the interest in this topic and your wonderful presentation. I'd be remiss if not to mention a couple things. One is we've shown the Rabbi's cat at the New York City
yeah, so great. Yeah.
And also Levantine, Raphael Balalu's film about Jacqueline Kahanoff.
I don't know that. I'd like to see that. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I'd be very happy to make it available to you. And actually, Raphael is right now in Morocco. So trying to he always wanted to go back and to reconnect with the region. I just heard from him.
I'd love it if you'd send me a way to see that. That would be great.
We'll make it happen. The other thing is, as many of you know, I wear two hats. One is with the American Sephardi Federation, the other is with Digital Heritage Mapping and the Diarna Project. And the president and co-founder of Digital Heritage Mapping and Diarna is Professor Frances Molino, with whom we've worked to document many of the Alliance sites throughout North Africa. And she has written and done research and is working always to tell the stories of the Sephardic women who were the teachers in the Alliance schools.
Oh, yeah.
And Professor Molino and Yael Azaguri are currently at work on a new translation and new English edition of Blanche Bendahan's work from Oran. Yeah, they're finished. They're looking for a publisher at present. So hopefully it won't be too long, but I just wanted to also make that everyone aware of that tremendous project.
So let me just also say there were a bunch of themes that I wanted to talk about that emerge in some of the novels that I read, and I'm not going to have a chance or the ability to call all of those things up, but for further discussion. But there are some really interesting parallels that I saw in a lot of the texts that I read. One of which, I'll just mention one, which is that, and these are in many Iraqi stories, there are many Iraqi stories of women who breastfeed the children of their neighbors, whether they are Muslim or Jewish. And the children grow up thinking of each other as brothers and sisters because they were nursed by the same woman. And there is actually a Sharia law, an Islamic law. If you are nursed by one woman, you are considered to be a sibling. There's a category called milk sibling. It's a legal category. And it has all the responsibilities and prohibitions that are associated with being a sibling. So obviously incest is a prohibition, but connection is a responsibility. And we see that in a lot of Iraqi memoirs and novels is fascinating. And the novel I translated by Toby Nathan, the French novel, A Land Like You, there's a situation like that where a Muslim woman nurses a young Jewish child whose mother has no milk, and he grows up in love. He falls in love with his twin, his milk sibling, and I had never come across that word before, but it is actually, you can look it up in Wikipedia. There is a category in Islamic law that makes this very sort of kind of a sacred bond between children who are nursed by the same woman. So, and that's central to that novel, Land Like You. And I worked on the novel and I had no idea until after I came across it in other texts. It's in Rais, it's in The Dove Flyer by Eli Amir. It's in Sweet Dates in Basra. It shows up everywhere. So apparently it was pretty common that women, Muslim and Jewish women living side by side, didn't care, what the religion of the child was. They had milk and the other woman didn't have milk, and so they gave them their milk. There you go. So I think that's fascinating. And so that's what apparently happened in real life, and it comes out in a lot of the texts.
Thank you.
And
sorry. I just want to be conscientious of people's time, even though we started a little late, so we did go over, and I appreciate everyone for staying. And Joyce, thank you very much for staying. I don't know if you want to, I'm sure people want to say at least hello, so you're more than welcome to stay on. I'll leave the room open for a few more minutes, but I did want to close it out and say thank you very much. I do want to also encourage everyone. Oh, first, I'm going to send Joyce a reminder that she'll send us a list of the authors, like people have been requesting. I know some
and
of the
a bibliography, a really good bibliography, yeah.
So that would be wonderful, and so I will forward that to everybody who is here today. And if there's somebody from Jerba, that was also a request.
Oh,
if you
yeah.
could add that.
Yeah.
So just to add that to the list. So yes, look out for that in the next day or two. We'll follow up with that.
It's I think it's a field that hasn't fully been touched yet. I think it's a whole area of exploration that is worth looking into.
Yes, there's much more to speak about here, and maybe Amiel will join us another time and continue the conversation, or we'll continue with some of the other people who have come up here. And so we definitely, this is a conversation obviously that needs to be had. I do want to point out before I close out that please keep joining us in the programs. We have a wonderful program on Sunday together with the Ben Gurion Center in the south of Israel that talks about the way these Jews from Arab countries were treated when they came to Israel, and we'll call out Ben Gurion on that. And it really is an interactive, and I was shocked with how open and honest the Ben Gurion Center was when bringing this up. It is not just idolizing Ben Gurion. So I do want to put that out there. We also have a Jamaican history Jamaican cemeteries next week. So interesting things coming up. We look forward to seeing everyone. And like I said, I will keep the room open for a few more minutes, so feel free to talk amongst yourselves. And we look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Dora, for inviting me to do this and for putting up with my technical difficulties. And I'm very,
like I said, your 75% is most of ours 150%. So this was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you.
Hi, Joyce. How are you?
Good. Who is that? I don't know.
This is Mariam.
Yes. Hi, Mariam.
Hi. Yes. Hi.
Mariam's my Persian friend. Yeah.
As a matter of fact, I was just going to mention about the French language being so, considered an elite language in Iran at the time. Like in I think the first of 20th century, like my aunt, my father, they were all, and my mother, they were all, they studied French as a second language in high school. But Iran was not a colony, so they kind of, then they left. And somehow they were wiped out or something. I don't know. But the French school still exists in Isfahan, although there are no more French people teaching it. But I guess in the memory of,
and I want to say two things. I mean, one is, Bourdieu, the philosopher, has this notion of cultural capital, right? So French gave people cultural capital, right? It gave them something they could trade on. And then being a Francophile myself, I still think, French is a beautiful language, and French culture is beautiful culture. But there are some problems, and we're seeing those problems emerge as we speak as well. So,
that's it. Yeah, thank you.